guys, and welcome to our podcast, Dura Lex Sed Lex. I'm Melissa.
And I'm Anna.
And today we have a guest on our show, Mr. de Wilde, a lecturer for international relations. We as LLB students don't really do a lot of international relations courses. We do have some knowledge on it, but we're not exactly very versed on it. So today we're hoping to learn more with Mr. de Wilde. And yeah, let's get started.
Perfect. So could you please introduce yourself to the listeners that may not know you yet and what your research and teaching expertise is?
Wow. Thanks for inviting me, for having me here. I'm a professor in international relations and security studies, and that goes back to a study in history, and then later on I specialized in international relations and peace research. And I worked a lot together with international lawyers, to be honest. Yeah.
If you could explain, maybe in your own words, what international relations encompass and what can be understood by international relations.
Yeah, thanks. Originally, it stems a bit from diplomatic studies and foreign policy analysis. So the question is how to conduct policies towards other countries, fairly state-centric in that part of its origin. And then in the 19th century, people started to study that more systematically. Another branch emerges from more transnational relations, where you have social movements that also operate across borders, and therefore also have questions about how do we organize ourselves on an international scale. So that's part of the background.
Perfect. So could you please explain to us quickly what the difference between transnational and international law is?
The legal aspect is one thing, but the term transnational emerged mainly in the 1970s as a response to the state-centric nature of dominant theories in international relations, which said, well, the original idea is that you have domestic politics, you have a state apparatus, and then you have international politics. And the state is as a kind of filter in between these two realms. Mm-hmm. But if you look at how world society actually functions, there are a lot of direct connections across borders. Mm-hmm. So the idea of this filter is a bit arbitrary. And with the rise of globalization, which actually goes back to the 16th century, but with the present phase of globalization, the question was, well, are governments really in control of politics, both domestically and internationally? And the term transnational relations then emerged to express the kind of communications between societies and across societies. The difference between national law and international law, well, the main difference is the lack of authority in an international setting. So the status of international law is quite different. It's very difficult to enforce it. And so in the end, you're dependent on the normative structure in which states are functioning. And that's, of course, also the case with domestic law. We don't need police officers on every street corner, at least not in our societies. And if you do, something is seriously wrong with that domestic order. So also there, a lot depends on what we call willing compliance. So it's not enforced behavior, but well, there should be rules, they need to be observed, and they don't need to be enforced all the time in order to be recognized and observed. And this is the same in international relations, where you have independent states, at least in terms of legal terms, they are sovereign, whether it's Liechtenstein or China. In their mutual relations, they somehow learn to recognize a collective interest in observing specific rules, even if they break them. But that's also the same in domestic law. If someone steals your bike, then the thief says, now it's mine, and they treat it as their property. And if you then steal back to saying, hey, you're stealing my bike. So even the thief has an idea of property and property rights. And that's in international law more or less similar.
Thank you very much for your answer. When did international relations gain their importance and what is their significance in society today? You mentioned something about the 19th century. Is that where the root came to be?
Well, as long as rulers have interaction with other rulers, there is a need for foreign policies and foreign policy behavior. That's one side of the coin. And so in that sense, it dates back ancient times. And in India, there were already theorists of how to conduct international politics. In ancient China, there are theories about how to behave towards others. But the more academic approach to international relations as a discipline started in the 19th century. And it's an interesting story because so far originally we were always told that it was the First World War that triggered the idea, well, what we are doing now is irrational, but it's the outcome of a rational process. Everyone expected war, everyone prepared for war, and then the outcome is massive killings and stalemates which were not foreseen. And then it ends with the conclusion, never again. A conclusion reached again in 1945. So the question is, how can we understand the causes of war and the conditions for peace? Actually, the basis of peace research, as we know it since the 1940s, 1950s. This was also a strong motivation after the First World War in Europe. And so we see in Aberystwyth, they have the pleasure of installing the first European chair in international relations. Recent research, however, more from a post-colonial and decolonial perspective, have shown that the roots are older, and in the 19th century, especially in the United States, there was a question: how can we survive as a white dominant race in a world which is largely colored, and how can we preserve our supremacy? So there was a clear empirical basis for studying international relations with the purpose to preserve your position in the world order. And it's a very welcome, sobering narrative in comparison to the first one, because the first one has this Eurocentric idea that we know how to behave correctly, and well, history proves us wrong time and again. But also in the disciplinary narratives that we have about the origins of our thinking, there is a lot of criticism nowadays on how we tell the story of the roots of international relations.
A beautiful analysis. So I want to diverge a little bit away from the basis of international relations and kind of more towards the theories of it. So I have a specific question for you about, like, if you could please elaborate upon like realism and liberalism, what the two are, because they're like, I want to say like the two basis theories of international relations, and how they kind of play into the whole body of international relations.
It's a broad question. There is an interesting development here. When I was studying international relations in the 1970s, early 80s, so long time ago, there were no textbooks. There was only one or two of them that tried to give a comprehensive overview of competing theories or complementary theories in international relations. There were mainly classics that you had to study, and it's quite interesting. I studied in Utrecht a course on international relations, taught, by the way, by someone from international law. And there we had to read Politics Among Nations by Hans J. Morgenthau, who is known as the kind of, well, one of the godfathers of classical realism. So politics is about power, and it's a zero-sum situation. So yeah, the ones who are strongest will dominate the game, if you can call it a game. Later on, we discovered, by the way, that Morgenthau himself is quite an idealist. If you look to the later chapters of his same book, he's looking at the United Nations, because they are the only ones, and international law are the only ones who can rescue us from nuclear war, a major problem in the time that he wrote this book in 1948. So that was the way IR was told. At the same time, I did a similar course here in Groningen, by the Peace Research Institute, which at that time was also part of the Faculty of Law. So the connections were quite strong between politics and law in that sense. And there we studied a more novel book, Power and Interdependence, by Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye, who published this in 1977. And this is where this transnationalism and complex interdependence and, well, the kind of liberal theories that you were referring to were highlighted to a greater extent. Out of that development, we got something that was called the paradigm debate. A paradigm is a model, a set of unquestioned assumptions, and on that basis you start theorizing the world around you. And this liberal way of thinking had different assumptions about the world than this more classical realist way of thinking. And then scholars started to contrast these theories and called it the paradigm debate. They added neo-Marxist theories, which they then called structuralism. And out of this, we got gradually the modern evolution of higher theories. There have been various debates, but when it comes to liberalism, realism, it dates back to the 1970s in that sense.
That's very interesting. Do you believe that all of the theories they're interdependent, they all play into each other, like they're somehow interlinked? Or do you think they're very much separate? Because you also mentioned post-structuralism, and there's also another theory called constructivism. Like there's all of these different terms, but at the end of the day, do you think it's all leading towards a bigger picture of international relations in a way?
Yeah, well, as a lecturer, we tend to have a kind of liberal mindsets or pluralistic mindsets where we not say anything goes, far from that, but where we say we need to understand the different ways in which people perceive international relations and to see where the logic takes us. Perhaps there is an implicit belief that this will mean progress, but don't try to define what progress is in theorizing. There are major contrasts. So the more recent developments we find in, you mentioned post-structuralist theories and then especially post-colonial theories. They really add a new dimension to what we perceiving international relations. The same has been done by feminist theories. That dates back actually more than a century, but some have described it as a very slow revolution. And so it takes time apparently to accustom these theories. Some are simply conflicting, some find syntheses, and some can be seen as complementary.
Thank you very much for your answer. This is very new to us as LLB students. We don't really engage a lot with theory. We engage more with international relations on, I think the biggest common denominator being the Vienna Convention. So the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations and on treaties. So that's why we wanted to ask you, could we say that international relations are governed by international law in this aspect, considering that we have such documents as the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations?
Let me say first, we focus on theories, but we also focus on methodologies. And so first is in which way are we reasoning? And then the second thing is how do we know what we know? And so that's a methodological question. And if you compare with medicine, you can go to a doctor with some symptoms, and if you go to an acupuncturist, you get a different treatment than when you go to a homeopathist or to a regular. And we call them the others regular because they are dominant in our culture. So depending on the paradigm, so the way you perceive in this case the body, you have a different idea about cures and treatments. There you see the same thing. They can be sometimes added up, but within each of these treatments you have a lot of discussions on how do we know what we know. So what do we observe? How do we do this? Well, international law, the way you describe it here, it's certainly not steering IR. It's part of it. I tend to say that law is the continuation of politics with the use of other means, like von Clausewitz has said that war is the continuation of politics with the use of other means. And so law is a normative setting in which you get specific discourses. and that can determine part of the behavior. And what we notice is that, for example, in international organizations, the same states may show different kind of behavior than in their bilateral relations or other settings. To give you an illustration, one of our PhD students, she's from Ukraine, is studying energy relations between the Russian Federation and the European Union. And she did so already before the present phase of the war. And what she is doing is looking at these relations in the setting of international organizations. So how do Russia and European EU states relate to each other in IRENA, where they are discussing renewable energy, or in the International Energy Agency, or in the International Gas Union, which is a group of industries in the gas sector. So how does the normative setting of these organizations influence their behavior? And her second case study is geopolitics, where we are lacking this kind of international law frames. There is a normative setting, but it's the setting of geopolitics in which we see a kind of, traditional 19th century territorial thinking. And then energy has a completely different role, as we can witness nowadays in the news on a daily basis. So the setting in which politics are conducted has a major impact on what kind of policies you will get.
That's very interesting. I know that you also work on Eudiplo, I think, right? Because I also did research for that project there as well. And my next question kind of leads on from there. Do you have in mind, I know obviously every event in politics, international relations is very prominent and very still talked about nowadays, but in the last century, which one would you say defined international relations the most up until now, or which was most groundbreaking?
I tend to see events as symptoms of more structural developments. So, and this is something I've not mentioned so far, but we, in international relations, especially when you look at theories, we look at different levels of analysis. So in the beginning, I was mentioning diplomatic relations. Well, that's how states behave to each other on a day-to-day basis, so to speak, and how they organize it. It involves bureaucratic politics and public administration, all these kind of things. You can also look at world politics from a more structural point of view, where you just observe this crazy planet and ask yourself, well, how do they do this? What makes people organize themselves the way they do, both in terms of conflict and in cooperation? And then you get a different idea on what matters or not. And in day-to-day politics, everything seems to be important, but often it takes time to see how things work out. And then it's up to partly historians to discuss together with more theoretical perspectives what are the crucial turning points, what are the game changers. And that's hard to say in general. We tend to observe various categories here in our studies. In security studies, we look at, what is great power politics doing? So the Second World War, the end of the Cold War itself, of course, the global war on terrorism, that has major impact on the discourses that we have. And nowadays, everyone looks again at Russian aggression in Ukraine, and which is throwing us back to the 19th century, also due to the way that we are responding to it. So that's one of the factors you look at. Another one would be technology. We are deeply concerned about cybersecurity and what this phase of globalization means. Social media that turn out to be asocial media. So it's something that you have to watch carefully and see what does it do with your society, also in terms of surveillance techniques. Then there are events that may have an impact. 9/11 has been quite important in that sense, but now the 24th of February will have a similar kind of meaning, at least for the time being. So that triggers specific responses and policies. So it's more interesting to see what is behind the choice of a moment than what is the moment.
Thank you very much for your answer. Now, moving on to a different question. How did international relations develop during the second half of the 20th century and leading up to that? Could we say that this development of international relations led to, or maybe had a significant role in the process of globalization and society as we know it today?
I'd like to divide that question into two parts, because one is the more academic approach and the development of IR as a academic activity. And there we see a lot of developments and progress. The field is growing, it's more structured, there's more diversity, it's vibrant, and there is space for innovation. If you look at the international conferences, the International Studies Association, which is an American-based umbrella organization for IR, I think the conferences nowadays have around 3,000 participants in hundreds of panels, and that is gain in the sense of broadening the basis of IR. Whether it's gain in terms of theoretical, methodological progress is harder to tell, because that's not a matter of large numbers. But we have the illusion that if more and more people are active in this field, you can build a higher pyramid, so the top will also be higher. So that's one development, and I mentioned already the textbooks that are telling different stories. The other part of your question relates to what is the impact of IR on world politics. I'm quite skeptical there. Let's not overdo it. It depends a bit on the political structure and culture. In the US, you see that when there's a new government, a lot of people move in and out of the administration, and a large part goes back to universities and then goes from universities back to governmental positions. Well, that's quite exceptional, but has an impact because, well, what you're teaching there has an influence on what you're doing. I mentioned Joseph Nye at some point. He has been quite active in the UN, for example. Classic examples of people like Kissinger and others. So if you look at some individuals, you can see clear connections. However, in general, what you notice also with the hundreds of students that leave our university as pluralist thinkers, much of their future thinking is determined by the organizations where they start working. So there's a fair chance that students of ours who find a job with Oxfam are closer to post-colonial theories, whereas students who are working for foreign affairs tend to become more classical realists or liberalists.
Looking back at the technological advances that you were talking about earlier with the different criteria of how to assess if an event is considered to be important or not in like international relations or supposed to have an impact, would you say that they have changed the nature of international relations?
It's always difficult to look into the future because we don't know it. That technology has an impact is clear, of course, it's obvious. It's interesting that before the First World War, there were a few people warning about the nature that it would get, and mainly due to two technological innovations. The one is the machine gun, so you can imagine, you can simply kill more soldiers with less men. And the other was barbed wire, so something that you won't expect, but barbed wire made it possible to force people into specific fronts, and this led to this trench warfare and took millions of lives. And so technology there had a clear impact on how the war could be conducted. Then, we entered the nuclear age in 1945 after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that had a major impact on international relations. And some scholars even argued that spreading nuclear weapons would be very profitable in the end from a peace making perspective, because it would show the irrationality of escalations. And I was never very charmed by this kind of perspectives, but there are influential thinkers. This was Kenneth Waltz, who is one of the leading thinkers for neo-realist theories. What he forgot is that the Cold War was not a Cold War, but that a lot of wars could be fought precisely because you did not want to escalate. So as long as you observe the upper limit of what you can do, there is a very wide margin to do whatever you please, as we see today in Ukraine. Many of, whether they believe the argument or not, but many NATO countries simply say if we respond with military means, we run the risk of ending up in a nuclear holocaust. Which is true, the risk is there. The question is how big it is, and all these things are quite immeasurable. So yes, technology makes a big difference. In the early 90s, an influential book on the transformation of war by Martin van Creveld, an Israeli historian, strategic thinker, said, well, no, modern warfare is a suicide bomber on a market square. And that's what we have seen as well. So you see, well, not very innovative technologies, but new practices in how you use means of violence. And that's what we still see in terrorism and in counterterrorism. And of course now the big question is, what is cyberspace doing to our reality? It's a new dimension, like the invention of aircraft and spatial travel. It adds a dimension to our social lives and political lives, legal lives, etc. And that makes us concerned. Whether these concerns will come true in their negative sense, we don't know. When they do, then all the people who have been warning today will be called visionary, and all the people who say, well, no, it will not be too important, will be wrong. But that's you cannot judge that from the theories that they have. That's one of the problems. But what is important for our time is that we are more and more aware of this. Things like facial recognition, practices we see. There is a growing surveillance culture. And there is also a growing tendency to use this. And it depends a bit on where you are on the planet, how this works out.
You kind of answered my next question. It was more related about how technological advancements change the nature of war, and you mentioned how now it is easier, for example, due to technological advancements, to kill multiple people, like weapons are more enhanced, but also it's more impersonal. You could say that, for example, drone strikes or, like such technological advancements, they often take away this personal one-on-one, let's say, combat element of you're actually conscious of taking away someone's life. So my question was like, how else are technological advancements, if you could develop a bit on that, changing the nature of war?
Well, one major change is that we are moving towards precision warfare. And so facial recognition is one of these parts. So their individual features can be fed into the weapon systems. Drone warfare is an example. They call it precision warfare, but it's not that precise. If you're a suspect, then probably everyone who is in the same building will be killed by the same drone. And we have seen how successful that was in Afghanistan. And we see how it works in Yemen and in Pakistan. And so it's one tendency. The other tendency is a bit related to law and perhaps even international law, that when we agreed upon a construct like Schengen, that we abolish national borders, you get a tendency that we want to check people on every street corner. So in a sense, we remove the border controls, and then from then on you have to identify more and more yourself in public buildings and etc. And that's a tendency we see, and it's increasing. And this leads to a kind of distrust society. I like to compare it with when you go by plane to another country. You're first treated as a suspect. You have to put your hands in the air. They have to search your body, even your purse. And if you have a nail clipper with you, you have to hand it in. I don't know why, but apparently you can hijack an airplane with a nail clipper. And then in first class you get knives and forks and whatever. I don't understand it, but that's the irrationality of it. But the rationality of it is you are a suspect unless I have checked you, and then you can board, and now we trust you again. Well, this practice is spreading throughout our societies to almost every street corner. A few years back, I was teaching at King's College in London, and I had to go through a metal detector to enter the classroom. So this is where we are heading in that sense. Is that warfare? No. Is it a peaceful society? No. Because we institutionalize distrust. And part of the logic of the state apparatus is precisely about that. It is about, ruling by fear, actually, and spreading fear, and then leading to respect for the state, because you have to observe the rules, and otherwise you are in deep trouble. And so that's a tendency you see, and therefore when you look at warfare, I think it's also interesting to see, how can we distinguish peaceful societies from war settings? Obviously, when we now go to Ukraine and we look at the news, we say, yes, this is traditional warfare as we know it from our books. But how peaceful or how aggressive are normal policies? Hannah Arendt, at some point, when she was discussing the work of von Clausewitz, turned his logic around. It's not war is the continuation of politics with the use of other means. She says, no, politics is the continuation of war with the use of other means. And that was a lesson learned, of course, in 2 world wars, but it's still with us. And so the distinction between war and peace is a difficult one to make. Also interesting from a legal perspective, internationally, if I still may continue on this, is how do we define this? In a country like the Netherlands, we nowadays have veterans again, military veterans, but does it mean we were in war? Veterans are the product of warfare. And no, apparently not. They can also be the product of peacekeeping operations. So we see a linguistic play almost with terms that avoid us to use terms that are forbidden by international law. So we don't commit aggression. The Russians don't commit aggression in their own view. They have a military operation, and they do this to rescue people who are suppressed by another people. So it's a peace-building logic, a peacekeeping logic that they evoke, partly because this is the language that international law requires us to speak. And the reality is still the same. So when we talk about variations in warfare, I'm concerned in how we conceptualize this.
So kind of leading on from this war and peace dynamic that you just mentioned, how can diplomacy play a role in maybe upholding peace or maybe going against war?
Well, I think that since the First World War, in most countries we see escalations into actual violence as the failure of diplomacy. That's historically fairly new, and I'm not sure anymore whether all diplomats think in this way or all politicians. But up to the First World War, it was quite obvious, at least in European history, if you wanted to hit the history books, you had to win a war, to wage it, to be heroic, earn your own statue, so to speak. And then with the disasters of the First and the Second World War, we got the opposite logic and said, well, no, war is the failure of diplomacy. It's not a crown on diplomacy. This has a major impact on diplomacy. It should therefore also have a major impact on how we study diplomacy, because if you take a long-term perspective, you will find diplomats in a completely different normative setting than where they are operating today. Well, in parallel to the world wars of the 20th century, we have seen the development of international organizations. And for diplomacy, this has opened a wide realm of new opportunities. So international civil servants working for the UN, for the EU, for the Council of Europe, for, well, you mentioned it, the World Health Organization nowadays, quite important. There's a whole arena created for diplomatic behavior. That is, I think, a very big achievement and a major reason why we see way less interstate conflicts escalating into warfare. They still do, but the escalation ladders have become much longer. If you take an organization like NATO, one of its successes is its internal cohesion. So the members, even Greece and Turkey, are kept in their position thanks to the diplomatic context in which they function.
How would you say diplomacy has developed during the last century in the sense of have diplomatic relations improved or worsened? Because on one side we do have international organizations like the UN or like, let's say, even more geographically concise ones like the European Union. But on the other hand, we do have more tensions between Russia and the USA, which are one of the largest global powers. So it's a bit paradoxical, you could say, that on the one hand we seem to be getting along better on paper, but on the other hand there's a lot, like the risk is very much enhanced now due to these tensions. So how is this actually happening?
Well, it's a complex field. We see diplomacy as a profession. There has been quite some questions about what is the use of embassies anymore in our present time. So one of the main tasks is to help stranded tourists, and that's not the ambition. So when you're an ambassador and you represent your country, you want to have a meaningful margin for your own policies and your own reports. But with modern communication, the Prime Minister flies in himself when it gets important, or they meet online nowadays. So you see quite a different setting there in the professional sense. On the other hand, as I mentioned, international organizations have created a lot of job opportunities for an international class of diplomats. And sometimes in the European setting, I think that the Eurocrats, as we call them nowadays, have replaced the aristocracy of the 18th, 19th century, where you have a pan-European class of civil servants who see it as their obligation to create consensus among their member states. And that's quite powerful, but more hidden. For the more dramatic aspects of diplomacy, conflict-related, etc., great power-related, we on the one hand see the development of the G7, G8, G9, G20, it depends a bit, but it's all related to the economy, and that's an interesting aspect. After the Cold War, we see that, in principle, all major states in the international system adhere to the liberal international economic order. They're all capitalists. They all follow that logic. Of course, there is a flip side, as we see it in global warming and in environmental agendas and in migration issues, etc. So that is part of what we observe. But in terms of diplomatic cohesion, they speak more or less the same language. So they have their conflicts about trade and about human rights. Yes, they also have their conflicts, but it's clearly subordinate to the economic logic. And so is that an achievement of diplomacy? No, not directly, but it has a major impact on how to conduct diplomacy.
So then how would you say these international organizations such as the UN, or also like as I said, more centralized like the EU, how do they directly affect international relations? Because obviously they also interlink the concept of diplomacy with other states. They have this connection.
Yeah, well, this is a long ongoing debate in international relations and in international law likewise. How strong are they? And then I'm not sure that's the way you should phrase the question in a sense, because it implies a kind of conflictive logic that if there is a conflict, here we have the international police officer who comes and helps us out. So now we have a criminal court, ICC, we have an international court of justice, etc. And then everyone from a more cynical perspective says, they don't work, look here, look there, look there. And I think what is more important to observe is what does it do in a more longer time frame with how we conduct international relations. And then it becomes part of the fabric, so to speak. In international relations, you have one branch of theory called the English school, which emphasizes a lot what they call international society. States are not just individual entities, no, they are a society, and it means that there are collective interests that they are aware of and that they want to observe. And this is what we see, that what we are now trying to make clear to Putin's Russia at the moment, where we say we will treat you as a pariah, we will exclude you from all our international realms, and including especially the economic sector. And hopefully this will not teach you a lesson, but it will help you to reconsider what you're doing. And if you want to teach them a lesson, you have to send in your own Marines and see whether you can beat them. So here you can clearly see that, again, escalation ladders are longer thanks to international organizations and the setting of international law.
Going a bit more to a specific example, obviously Brexit happened in 2016. How do you think, especially like considering within the realm of the European Union, how did you think this specific event affected international relations?
Well, it's an interesting aspect that we're dealing with. What we see more generally in this era is a kind of regression. If we are confronted, we are states, if we are confronted with problems, we try to isolate ourselves from it, build walls, put a wall around it. Trump won the elections with it, but we do the same in the Mediterranean when it comes to migration. So Frontex is one of the success stories at the moment of the EU. We tend to isolate ourselves. We see it in Hungary, we see it in Poland, we see it in Brexit. It's a clear sign of we are better off on our own than together. And we see it in a sense also in the conflict with Russia, that Russia follows also a similar logic. Let's restore the old borders and we are safe again. And I hope this is temporary, and I hope that the next generation then will flip back towards a more cooperative mode, but it's quite general. And apparently every generation has to discover how to deal with complexity. And this has been theorized by various scholars that complexity, when you're confronted with it, first you like to avoid it. So please don't bother me with all these factors. So you isolate yourself. The second phase then is, well, okay, if I can't avoid the complexity, let's try to control it. So it's more imperialist, and you try to be on top of all these complex things around you. And only if that fails as well, you enter in a cooperative mode. Apparently I have to accept that things are complex and it's give and take, and let's see how we fare. The problem is that if others are in a different phase than you are, you get situations like Ukraine, where it simply doesn't work together, it doesn't work out. Brexit as such, I think for the EU, well, in the short run, it means gold mine for lawyers, because you have to redo all your contracts and you have to find new structures. But when that work is done, well, Britain will be like Norway and Switzerland, and so very important for Europe and crucial in many ways, but in a different setting, and we can adjust to that. And so I don't expect too much trouble there. Well, in NATO they are still leading. There is indeed also this tendency in crisis to fall back, regression again, to the capitals. So what is Berlin saying? What is Paris doing? What is London doing? And then the EU, it is already quite remarkable that everyone is asking, what is the EU doing? Well, the EU is promising EU membership to Ukraine, and everyone, good grief, what are they doing now? So there is that tension. I think that behind Brexit there is another story, which has to do with perhaps the arrogance of the EU in the 1990s. It's very strange to observe that in the first decades of its existence, it was more powerful than it is today. So when the EU was formed in 1991-92, it was a magnet for all the former East Bloc countries and former Soviet countries. And that gave it enormous power, because everyone wanted to join the club. And we had a kind of institutionalized waiting room saying, well, no, first we have Copenhagen criteria. Oh no, and then you have to implement it as well. At that time, there was a strong federal idea, or confederal idea. We all of a sudden needed a constitution. And we had already an anthem and a flag, and we were trying to create an army, and we wanted a common border control, etc. And this led already at that stage to a lot of skepticism. And the EU was quite blind to that, and the EU adherents were quite blind to that process. But if you look at all these referenda, first already with Denmark about the EU itself, well, it was turned down in the first row. So this then escalated into Brexit, I think. And so in that sense, it's a sobering experience.
This is not a question just for the people who are listening and are interested in what you mentioned earlier for Hungary and Poland. We have a whole episode on that with Dr. John Morain. So if you're interested in that, you can check that episode out.
And now we will be moving into a, let's say, broader context, so not centering the EU. You mentioned economics a few minutes ago. So we were wondering, what role does economics play in international relations? Because can it be, for example, a reason for the development of international relations? Because as you mentioned, we do live in a capitalist society, so maybe it can be a motivation for why states act a certain way, or can it be considered more as a consequence in the sense of, let's say, penalties or sanctions like we see today with Russia, or just like general outcomes of how states interact?
There's a whole branch within IR that's called IPE, International Political Economy, and that branch is almost as rich in different approaches to what economy means in IR as IR itself. There is on the one hand the Marxist-oriented theories which put a lot of emphasis on the economy, capitalism and property relations and exploitation, how that runs. The counterpart is liberalism, which puts a lot of emphasis on the market, how that evolves, and then so state, society, market are three components that are central in IPE, also in the way we study it here in Groningen. And so in this realm you find the whole spectrum again for how to interpret the world economy. I've done myself quite a lot of research on environmental security, and already in 1994 we published the book The World at the Crossroads Towards a Sustainable, Equitable and Livable World. Quite ambitious, no one read it. But there we already posit there are two major problems from an environmental point of view. One is population pressure. It's not so much population growth as such, although that is also problematic, but that's not the bottom line. The bottom line is population pressure. So where are people located and what is needed to keep them alive in that setting? And the second is economic thinking. And that's the growth paradigm. You're sick if you don't grow. That's the logic of dominant economic thinking. And that's very extractive. And that is really a fundamental problem. And I think that our era is already since the late 19th century caught in this paradigm, this way of thinking. And I don't see how we can escape from it. If you look at energy transition as we do it now, it's a business case. That's why it works. If you look at the Green Deal of the EU, it's a business case. That's why it works. So it's all within the logic of economic thinking. And in the end, it's not about changing our consumerism, our behavior, our drive towards luxury, etc. And that is a major problem of how the economy affects world politics. Because if we are faced with the downside of this, you will see more natural hazards, you will see more industrial hazards, you will see more conflict related to that. It's not a one-to-one relationship, it's more complex, but it is affected by economic circumstances.
Just again, if you're interested in the Green Deal, we have an episode coming out on that as well with Dr. Squintani. By the time you're listening to this episode, that episode will be out already, so give that one a listen as well. And now for the question. This is one of the last questions. I'll just wrap this up as well. How would you explain to the average person why they should care about international relations and how it affects them personally?
Well, yes, I think as an academic you can't escape international relations as a fact of life. As a normal person, a non-academic, that's a normal person. As a non-academic you can't escape it either. If you go to a supermarket and you would be able to see, visualized at that moment that when you buy a vegetable or coffee or whatever product you see, if you could see the entire production chain, what is involved in just getting this on your plate. If you would visualize that, you would see it's international relations, it's global, it's a world economy, and we can't escape that. The next question would be, well, why should we be concerned? And that's then the normative agenda, but that's then at least triggered by giving you an idea of how intertwined we are in practice. And it would be good if we spread that out, but that doesn't mean that everyone has to read IR books or textbooks, or let's leave that to the people who find it fun to study international law and international relations, and then see how you can theorize all of this. But the more practical side of international relations should be emphasized way more also in our politics. I tend to ask students, what are we more dependent on the quality of our government or on the functioning of Microsoft and Google? So if we are without these companies tomorrow, or these companies are without proper management tomorrow, we have global effects. And well, we see how long norm formation periods in Dutch and Belgian politics can take, and everything keeps on running.
Thank you very much for that explanation. Now, last question, not necessarily related to you explaining anything, just for the students. Do you potentially have any open positions for students who are interested in helping you with research related or similar topics, even if they are LLB students, or do they have to be international relations students? Can they contact you for these kinds of positions, or are you busy at the moment?
I get a lot of requests, of course, in this realm. Well, in our department, we have a staff of some 60 people, and we have around 1,000 students to cater, including internships and research assistants, etc. But having said that, it's very good to have teams that are interdisciplinary. So it would be great if international law and European law students sit together more with IR students and, well, simply approach the same problems from different angles. And that would be a gain. We do this as scholars in interdisciplinary projects as well. But that would be the most interesting aspect, and then it would be good to involve lecturers from both teams. And so yes, drop me a line if you want to start up something in that realm.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. de Wilde, for coming onto the podcast. Thank you so much for talking with us today. It was a pleasure.
For me too, thanks.